Tonight's talk, the imperial theory industry and the compatible left intelligentsia, is a really important one because the people we have thought very often or initially being in the left have changed colors and become what I would not call Marxist anymore. And Professor Rockhill was very familiar with French cultural critique and the Frankfurt School and various schools of Marxist culture and a literary critique, has done something very wonderful, I think, um, in the spirit of someone I much admire, Walter Benjamin, because Professor Rockhill has exposed to us how variants of bourgeois thought aestheticize politics and how communists politicize aesthetics. And in doing this, Professor Rockhill has addressed the question of hegemony in its function of transformative consciousness or transformational consciousness, for the purpose of the expansion of imperialism and the necessity of developing a resistant politics of culture, which does not put a knife between culture and class. In this regard, Professor has conducted and thoroughly exposed American imperialism's outreach through the medium of cultural activities and its influence on global intelligentsia, particularly through various outreaches of CIA, the US State Department, and private corporations into academia and broader intellectual production, trying to create a global environment of anti-communism. And this reminds me of the time when I was a student in the 60s in Calcutta and teacher in the 70s, that Congress for Cultural Freedom, Encounter Group, and United States Information Service were all very active here and trying to recruit young people as well as intelligentsia to the cause of anti-communism. USS turn to the East happened much earlier. We had gone through of Korea and Vietnam and so on. And there was a really, given the kind of left culture in West Bengal at that time, there was really a very big attempt on the part of people like Edward Shields and Broomfield, John Broomfield, Myron Weiner, and Professor Dimmock from Chicago. Essentially, a lot of people were coming and going here trying to recruit people. And I think that's very important because it drew away some really interesting and intelligent people from pursuing Marxism and took them towards the United States. And it was backed also by ability to give scholarships and various kinds of trips to different US universities, University of Iowa being a very central place at that time. And people going there, and it became an influence, I think, partially in setting up a certain kind of comparative literature in Jadavpur University and probably in other places as well. But those days are gone now, at least here, and Americans are no longer trying to recruit actively because much recruiting has been done and many are out of the country, and now they no longer need to recruit because there is often a spontaneous departure to the imperialist core from our parts of the world. So I just wanted to mention this because I read Professor Rockhill's writings earlier also with much interest in this. And I think that what is happening now is not only blatant, but also subtle influencing of the world of Marxist thought in a direction that is exemplified in Rethinking Marxism, both mentioning or alluding to the journal, but also in the new left turns that are constantly happening in it, whereby it's becoming, in the name of Marx and Marxism, there's been a kind of invention of Marx that is, serving the ideological purpose and supposed to be helping us to think deeply about Marx. But most of the time, what it does is leads you away from Marx towards other ways of thinking. And I think Professor Rockhill will talk about much of this imperialist cultural industry. So with that, I invite Professor Rockhill to speak. And the books that I wanted to mention, and I am acquainted with some of his other work as well, have been already mentioned by Shondeep Munshi. So Professor Rockhill, please join us.
Okay, sorry, I had trouble unmuting myself there. Thank you so much. It is a real pleasure and honor to be able to share some of my research with you and get feedback from you. Himani Bannerji's opening comments resonate very, very strongly, and I think give a perfect framing to my work and my concerns. I'd also like to thank all of the organizers for this conference, and apologies for any mispronunciations on my part. Suchetani Chattopadhyaya, Surav Banerjee, Sandeep Munshi, and I'm sure a lot of other people who have gone into organizing this, getting the poster ready and setting everything up. I know a lot of labor goes into coordinating these types of things, and I greatly appreciate it. What I thought I would do with the time that I have, which is about 30 to 40 minutes, is give you a brief outline of the book that I'm currently completing for Monthly Review Press, and also give you a few concrete examples so that you have a sense both of the overall conceptual architectonic, if you will, but then also some of the concrete details that come out in the book. So this book, The Intellectual World War is the title, seeks to contribute to contemporary Marxist scholarship in a number of ways, including by making two arguments concerning the development of the superstructure in the imperial core. Marx described the ideological superstructure as composed of two elements: the political legal apparatus on the one hand, and forms of social consciousness, such as those operative in religion, culture, and philosophy on the other. The first argument in this book has to do with this first element, the political legal apparatus of the bourgeois state, and it consists in demonstrating that it needs to be understood itself in terms of two components, particularly in the era of monopoly capitalism or imperialism. There's the visible form of legal government that administers the spectacle of public politics, but there's also an invisible government that manages the population, often through illegal means. And as Annie Lacroix has brilliantly explained, the increasing concentration of wealth under capitalism, which takes on extreme forms in the imperial phase of monopoly finance capital, has required greater recourse on the part of the bourgeois state to the men and women of the shadows. I thereby draw on a large body of Marxist research to argue that the bourgeois state needs to be understood in terms of a political spectacle and behind-the-scenes manipulation. The second argument that the book advances concerning the superstructure is that it is helpful to postulate a third element. In addition to the two-faced political legal apparatus and social consciousness, there is a centralized apparatus that forges, formats, and preserves this consciousness, which of course Marx and Engels already saw, and they wrote quite poignantly on the kind of industry of philosophy, in particular in the German ideology. So in my own work, drawing on figures like Bertolt Brecht, I propose to call this system of cultural production, circulation, and consumption the cultural apparatus. It includes all of the cultural, religious, and intellectual institutions that forge people as thinking beings and format their consciousness. In this regard, ideology is not only a byproduct of the material relations of production, it is also forged, maintained, and overseen by an ensemble of institutionalized forces that condition social consciousness. In the imperialist era of monopoly capitalism, this cultural apparatus is so highly industrialized and centralized that it arguably exercises an awesome degree of power never before seen in history. The majority of the book then focuses on this cultural apparatus, and even more specifically on the intellectual apparatus. It does this through a dialectical analysis of the relationship between the economic base and the superstructure, which I describe in terms of a political economy of knowledge production. So the political economy of knowledge production, which is integral to this analysis, allows us to track the impact of economic forces on the types of knowledge that are produced, widely circulated, and consumed. It also sheds light on which forms of knowledge are excluded from support, marginalized, and targeted for widespread discrediting. As we'll see, there are multiple forces that have been at work in the political economy driving the capitalist intellectual apparatus. Universities have, of course, been key since they are major corporations involved in the production and dissemination of knowledge. The same, of course, is true of think tanks and various intellectual organizations and associations. The publishing industry has been equally central for its importance in the distribution and consumption of knowledge, and the mass media has played a major role, as well as culture industries. The capitalist ruling class, which largely controls and oversees the institutions just mentioned, has also interceded rather directly by using its foundations to exercise its dominion over intellectual production, circulation, and consumption. The so-called Big Three foundations, Rockefeller, Ford, and Carnegie, have played the largest role, but many smaller foundations have also been mobilized. The bourgeois state has been very involved at multiple different levels, especially through its national security state, which has played an extremely important, though widely under-theorized, role in propaganda and public relations. In 1975, the Church Committee in the United States helped shed light on the intimate relationship between the ruling class's foundations and the invisible government. Quote, "The CIA's intrusion into the foundation field in the 1960s can only be described as massive. Excluding grants from the Big Three," and it's interesting as a side note that the Church Committee excluded the Big Three, who actually worked very intimately with the Central Intelligence Agency, thereby running cover for them. But outside of the Big Three, this is the rest of the quote, "Of the 700 grants, over $10,000, given by 164 other foundations during the period 1963 to 1966, at least 108 involved partial or complete CIA funding. More importantly, CIA funding was involved in nearly half the grants of the non-Big Three foundations made during this period in the field of international activities. In the same period, more than 1/3 of the grants awarded by non-Big Three in the physical, life, and social sciences also involved CIA funding." So you have the invisible side of the bourgeois state working hand in glove with the foundations that are obviously just extensions of the corporatocracy in order to influence intellectual production. In this regard, I think it's important to see how state forces and financial forces obviously work together and collaborate on precisely these types of activities. So in order to understand the analysis that I undertake in this book, it is imperative to recognize that just as there is a car industry and a music industry, there is a theory industry. Intellectual production is not the result of individuals thinking on their own or entering into a free marketplace of ideas. It is a consequence of the overall social relations of intellectual production, and thus an entire industry that not only creates and distributes theoretical products, but also manufactures the intellectuals who make them in the first place. This industry has evolved significantly over time. Whereas the commodification of ideas accompanies capitalism like its shadow, there has been a veritable industrialization of knowledge production in the modern age. Although this has been a process devoid of sharp breaks, at least within the capitalist world, the era of imperialism has brought with it a global intellectual industry whose level of development far surpasses that of the 19th century. In our day and age, there is an extremely powerful industry with global networks for the production, circulation, and consumption of ideas. Its apex is situated in the imperial core, led by the United States. So the imperial industry of ideas has produced an intellectual labor aristocracy, meaning a group of extremely privileged thinkers in the imperial core who are elevated socially and economically above those in society at large, as well as those situated in the periphery. Moreover, there's a comprador intellectual labor aristocracy that exists and garners in the periphery that garners value from its subservience to the core's theoretical nobility. People like Gayatri Spivak from India, I think, would be a very good example of that. To become a number, although she was fully integrated into the intellectual labor aristocracy in the core, of course, to become a member of this labor aristocracy, just as in other industries, you need to spend years, even decades, proving your fealty to the intellectual apparatus and being tested on your ability to perform. The highest echelons of this theoretical aristocracy are generally occupied by those who, like Samuel Huntington and Francis Fukuyama, have made the greatest contributions to the ideological agenda of those who control the means of intellectual production. They're the leading thinkers of the day because they're the top producers of ideological products. This is how we need to understand what is often called the star system. The leading intellectual luminaries of the capitalist world, very much like movie stars, are those who have contributed the most valuable commodities for the industry. It's important to note, I'll be very quick on this, that both Fukuyama and Huntington not only work at prestige institutions in the United States, but they have deep ties to the US national security state, as well as to the corporatocracy and the world of foundations, meaning that they are instrumentalized intellectuals on the part of the capitalist ruling class and its bourgeois state. In the case of Huntington, he spent half a century at Harvard's Center for International Affairs, which was founded by CIA-connected Henry Kissinger and Robert Bowie, who was a trusted confidant of John J. McCloy and served as the director of policy planning, who oversaw the US State Department's internal think tank, right? So at Harvard, this is basically an external think tank to the US State Department. It's what's referred to as a cutout. Moreover, Huntington became White House coordinator of security planning for the National Security Council. So he was a national security state operative during the Carter administration. He, in his famous book, The Clash of Civilizations, which is obviously profoundly anti-communist and anti-Marxist, it was, in his own words, quote, made possible by the financial support of the John M. Olin Foundation and the Smith Richardson Foundation. Both foundations are major funders of neoconservatism, of the American Enterprise Institute. And so what he's literally telling us in his book is that he is an intellectual who has been bought by the capitalist ruling class, more specifically the arms industry and the pharmaceutical industry, which is where these two foundations come from, and a national security state operative who is producing the ideology that then becomes the bestseller due to the fact that there's so much power exercised over the system of distribution and consumption. But the book itself does not focus on, although I touch on people like Huntington and Fukuyama, or Anne Applebaum or other people like this, the book really focuses on a specific niche within the imperial intellectual industry by examining the work of those who have been marketed as radical theorists, even Marxists, in various ways. Some of them even say that they're communists or present themselves as anti-capitalists. Others are inspired more directly by anarchism or libertarian socialist traditions. And still others proffer a form of radical critique that refuses to be contained within any of these labels. What they all share in common, however, is that they have been promoted internationally as the most important leftist intellectuals of the day. They're the leading luminaries of a sector of the industry of intellectual production that might best be described as the radical theory industry in the imperial core. This industry has primarily been developed during the phase of capitalist accumulation known as neoliberalism, but with roots going back further. It's therefore impossible to separate it from the Cold War, and more specifically, from the intellectual world war on communism. since the bourgeois cultural apparatus has been incapable of simply eliminating Marxism due to its broad public appeal, its clear explanatory power, and its proven ability to transform society, it has been faced with the dilemma of how best to deal with its existence. As the book attempts to show, its preferred tactic has been to use its monopoly control over the theory industry to internationally promote a commodified version of Marxism, often referred to as Western Marxism or cultural Marxism, as well as forms of edgy theory that purport to surpass Marxism in their radicality and sophistication. If we simplify things to the extreme, we can say that the mantra of the theory industry has been, if you cannot beat your competitors, the actual Marxists, then flood the market with well-packaged but cheap knockoffs, promote them to no end, and try to bury your competitors as passé. This book focuses on the two foundational reference points for this contemporary radical theory industry: German-style critical theory coming out of the Frankfurt School and French theory, although there's also extensive engagement with some Italian theory, British theory, and contemporary Anglophone so-called radical or critical theory. There are 2 chapters that deal with the Frankfurt School, 5 on French theory, and then the final 2 chapters really look at the radical theory industry internationally, but with a focus on the imperial core, mainly Western Europe and the United States. Although these intellectual traditions have marketed themselves as distinct, and each thinker within them has promoted their own idiosyncratic brand, there's a remarkable level of ideological consistency that is very important to see. What they all share in common is their opposition to actually existing socialism, with only the rarest and absolutely explainable exceptions. They generally reject communist parties and anti-imperialist state-building projects, and any political solutions they put forth for the problems they diagnose within the capital world are often, at best, idealist projections of a magical third way beyond capitalism and socialism. By situating the radical theory industry within the intellectual apparatus of the dominant capitalist powers and their political economy of knowledge production, as well as within the ongoing context of the Cold War's intellectual world war on communism, this book seeks to elucidate the ideological center of gravity of the left intelligentsia in the imperial core, which is what is known as the compatible left or the respectable left. This term, as I analyze in the book, has been widely used by the US national security state to refer to the type of left that is acceptable, a left that rejects socialism in the real world and is ultimately respectable because it is compatible with capitalism and even imperialism. I should note, moreover, that the analysis in the book is thoroughly dialectical, meaning that it does acknowledge that the intellectuals studied have indeed mobilized their subjective agency. They're not just on puppet strings and doing what the string pullers or the kind of corporate and bourgeois marionette players want them to do. In certain instances, these intellectuals formulated critiques of capitalism, neoliberalism, consumer society, and the culture industry. So part of my analysis is a variegated analysis that takes those forms of agency very seriously, because in part of the very incorrect stereotype concerning Marxism that it is just determinist and doesn't allow for agency, which is, of course, absolutely incorrect. So far from denying the agency of the intellectuals involved in the radical theory industry, I would merely like to situate this agency within the objective social world, which entails asking a very simple and practical question that is rarely raised within these academic circles. If capitalism is recognized as having negative effects, as a lot of the radical theorists will recognize, what is to be done about it? The deeper one mines down into the lives and work of the theorists under question, sifting through the deliberate obscurantism of their discourse, the more obvious their responses become, and the easier it is to understand the primary social function of their shared intellectual project. For as critical as some of them are of capitalism, they regularly affirm that there is no real alternative. What is more, any criticisms of capitalism pale in comparison to their uncompromising condemnation of socialism. Their brand of radical theory ultimately leads it implicitly or explicitly to a politics of capitalist accommodation, since socialism itself is judged to be far worse than the extant capitalist order. They therefore proffer what we might refer to as ABS theory, anything but socialism. The theorists examined in this book, again, mainly Frankfurt School critical theory, French theorists, and then contemporary theorists like Judith Butler, Wendy Brown, Nancy Fraser, Sheila Ben-Habib, etc., who are inspired directly by this tradition and come out of it. So the theorists examined also exercise their agency in dedicating themselves to specific political and ideological struggles. Some of them have worked very explicitly within the tradition of Friedrich Nietzsche and Martin Heidegger in order to combat Marxism, and a few have actively contributed to anti-communist subversion campaigns like Jacques Derrida in Czechoslovakia and Michel Foucault in Poland. I'll say more about this in a moment. Others have primarily contributed to ideological and cultural efforts to discredit communism, as is clearly visible in the work of Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. Still others, like Alain Badiou and Slavoj Žižek, Antonio Negri, and those working more generally in a kind of radical form of theory that became very popular in the early 21st century, they've presented themselves as the only real communists by advocating for a mysterious third way beyond both capitalism and socialism that is thoroughly idealist. They've positioned themselves on an idealist stairway to heaven in an attempt to convince their readership that a magical path transcends the terrestrial class struggle between imperialism and actually existing socialism. Finally, some of the authors exhibited in the book have moved between these positions over time. So a significant portion of this book will examine the objective social forces that have encouraged and fostered these types of activities. However, it's absolutely essential to recognize and account for the agency of those involved, and much of the book is dedicated to tracking that in great detail. In relationship to the system described as the imperial theory industry, the intellectuals who succeed and advance within it have mobilized their agency to play to the system. Far from acting as simple automatons, they've met the system halfway, a third of the way, or some other ratio. In doing so, they have received uplift in return, meaning opportunities to advance within the system by climbing the social ladder, advancing their careers, securing prestigious and lucrative academic appointments, publishing in premier outlets, gaining a large public following, having their work widely translated, being invited to international junkets, having access to the mainstream media, and ultimately occupying a position in the pantheon of bourgeois history. Given the extensive development of the theory industry and its imperial dominion, the uplift it provides far surpasses simple career advancement within a particular field. It literally makes individual theorists into global superstars perched at the very top of the intellectual labor aristocracy, which is an extremely lucrative position accompanied by a truly awesome power of cultural influence. So the principal form of agency that these thinkers have mobilized is opportunism. It is not the least bit surprising in this regard that these intellectuals have been so widely supported and promoted within the capitalist world and its imperial theory industry. In order to shore up the compatible, non-communist left over and against the threat of actually existing socialism, what better tactic than to champion scholars like these as some of the most important and even most radical thinkers of the contemporary world? Critical theory, and even Marxism, can thereby be redefined as a kind of anti-communist, radical theory that is not directly connected to class struggle from below, but rather freely criticizes all forms of domination, including quote-unquote authoritarian socialism, and which ultimately sides with capitalist control societies over and against the purported quote-unquote fascist horrors of powerful socialist states. That's a quote from Adorno and Horkheimer. In this regard, the group of theorists promoted by the imperial theory industry have played the role of radical recuperators. Under the guise of radicality, they ultimately work to recuperate potentially insurgent forces within the extant system by denying the existence of a real, concrete alternative. Their purported radicality can take on different forms. Some openly identify with the radically reactionary philosophies of Nietzsche and Heidegger, while others engage in the communist cosplay of petty bourgeois radicalism. Many of them combine elements of both extremes and shift back and forth based on the needs of the moment. So that is at least some of the overall architecture of the book. What I'd like to do is share a few concrete examples, and then we can open up for discussion and debate. The first example is looking at the work of Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault. Derrida cultivated a reputation for intellectual sophistication based in part on always problematizing the terms of debate and interrogating unquestioned assumptions. In the case of the Cold War, however, undecidability completely disappeared. Derrida was never on the fence regarding what side he was on, nor did he seek to bring sophistication and nuance to the analysis of his class enemies. Quote, "We must have very definite political priorities," end quote. This is Derrida, who flatly asserted this at the Sorbonne in March 1980, leaving no room for ambiguity. And this was a meeting convened by Catherine Audard to present and discuss with 50 French philosophers the anti-communist subversion campaign being run by Oxford philosophers in Czechoslovakia. Rather than expressing his signature skepticism, Derrida unflinchingly supported this binary campaign. As a matter of fact, he co-founded in 1981 a French chapter of the principal organization used by the British, the Jan Hus Educational Foundation, the JHEF, serving as its vice president in France. The JHEF brought together conservatives and right-wing intellectuals and artists who were opposed to communism, as well as some anti-communist liberals like Derrida, social democrats, and Trotskyists. The relevant political distinction was not the right-left dichotomy as it operates within the imperialist core, but the much more fundamental polarization between quote-unquote democracy and quote-unquote totalitarianism, meaning the global class struggle between the capitalist world and the socialist world. Derrida not only fully accepted this binary, but he also unquestioningly embraced the value hierarchy that positioned one side of this opposition above the other. As a matter of fact, this value-laden binary functioned as the transcendental horizon of his theoretical practice. I can't go into this in detail here, but I demonstrated in the book. I probably should have noted, I did my master's degree under Jacques Derrida, know his work very intimately and well from the inside. So this is not just a facile dismissal of his work. It's reading through his work, but situating it within the objective social totality. So while Derrida was busy sniffing out the specters of Western metaphysics within the canon, he was squarely operating within the parameters of Western imperialism. So the Jan Hus Educational Foundation that he was involved in ran subversive seminars and smuggled books into Eastern Europe. It mobilized press and media connections to bolster their cause, including Radio Oxford, the BBC, Radio Free Europe, and the Times, all of which have ties to the British and US national security state. They also engaged in an expansive pro-Western cultural campaign in Czechoslovakia and Western Europe, which included specific programs for music, art, theater, literature, film, television, and religion. To, quote, plant the seeds of opposition in the communist countries, they also established support networks for writers, scholars, musicians, and artists who were banned from presenting their work, meaning that they supported the work of anti-communist dissidents. All in all, the activities of the Jan Hus Educational Foundation, for which Derrida was the vice president of the French chapter, resembled in content, form, and scope many of the other anti-communist campaigns run by imperialist powers and their national security states during the Cultural Cold War, such as what was alluded to in the opening comments, the Congress for Cultural Freedom. The list of those intellectuals and artists involved in the Jan Hus Educational Foundation's destabilization activities reads like a veritable who's who of the Imperial Intelligentsia. Major figures from the Anglophone world included Charles Taylor, Roger Scruton, Tom Stoppard, Donald Davidson, E.P. Thompson, and Richard Rorty. Habermas was involved from Germany, as well as Ernst Tugendhat. In France, Derrida, Jean-François Lyotard, Jean-Luc Nancy, Etienne Balibar were all involved, as well as Paul Ricoeur, Alain Finkielkraut, and André Glucksmann, the probably quintessential anti-communist and close friend of Michel Foucault. Roger Scruton was driving force behind the Jan Hus Educational Foundation. He was one of the people who prompted Derrida to start the French chapter of the organization. And famously in 1985, Scruton published an article in which he made a passionate plea to garner support from the Central Intelligence Agency for cultural and intellectual war against communism, claiming that the CIA was a charitable organization serving a, quote, noble and nonviolent purpose, and explicitly denouncing the public outcry over the agency's funding of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Now, as far as I know, the Jan Hus Educational Foundation never received direct financial support from the CIA. However, it operated in the exact same networks that were being funded by the company, and it had the same objectives as these organizations supported. Moreover, it did receive funding from the most important CIA cutout, which is the National Endowment for Democracy. The person for helping to draft the legislation establishing the NED in 1983, Alan Weinstein, who was also a professor, candidly explained that, quote, a lot of what we do today was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA, end quote. This organization of anti-communist destabilization that Derrida worked very explicitly for also received funding from an impressive array of corporate and governmental sources with a record of supporting anti-communist subversion, including the Margaret Thatcher Foundation, the Open Society Fund, the Ford Foundation, the US Embassy in Prague, and the United States Information Agency, all of which have worked very, very closely with the US national security state. In this regard, Derrida clearly was not someone who lacked political commitment, which was one of the things that you often hear in the more kind of liberal or even Trotskyist critiques of postmodernism. Derrida was a committed political intellectual. It's just that his commitments were to anti-communism, so much so that he was famously arrested in Czechoslovakia when he had smuggled in books and other materials to share with the dissident intellectuals that were part of the destabilization campaigns that were being run by the Central Intelligence Agency at that point in time. It's interesting to note, moreover, that when Derrida returned to France, after this moment of being arrested in Czechoslovakia, which we could talk more about if people want, he was immediately met and supported by his old friend, Michel Foucault, with whom he had had a decades-long falling out. So Foucault and Derrida lined up on the most important political battle of the time, and that was the battle against communism. In the case of Foucault, he was actually doing more or less the same thing that Derrida was doing in Czechoslovakia, but instead in Poland. Beginning in the mid-1970s and with increasing intensity in the early 1980s, the prominent theorist of power relations, and this is according to one of his leading biographers, quote, spared no effort to help the dissidents from the countries of the East, end quote. He signed many pro-dissident petitions, publicly supported Solidarność on numerous occasions. Solidarność is a complicated movement, and I go into this history in the book. It began as a kind of more workers-oriented movement, but quickly became more of a petty bourgeois destabilization campaign. Its primary supporter in the West was the Central Intelligence Agency, which we know through internal documentation of that fact at this point in time. And Foucault himself publicly oversaw a Comité Solidarność, which is basically a fund to raise finances for anti-communist destabilization in the East. And that fund almost certainly had Central Intelligence Agency money trafficked through it. So Foucault spared no effort to support the cause of anti-communist dissidents in the East. He accused the Soviet Union of being a colonial force. He expressed the worry that the Soviet Union was imperialist and was going to take over and destroy Western Europe. So he was perfectly in line, not only with the Central Intelligence Agency's position, but also the Reagan doctrine, as I'll explain in a moment. So Foucault was not only actively engaged in supporting dissident politics in Eastern Europe through fundraising, delivering money and supplies, which he did himself physically, media events, publicity campaigns, public spectacles, publications, pressure campaigns, all aimed at eliminating socialism and integrating Eastern Europe into the Western fold. He shared this objective with Ronald Reagan. National Security Decision Directive 54, signed by Reagan in 1982, identifies the exact same objective. Quote, the primary long-term US goal in Eastern Europe is to loosen the Soviet hold on the region and thereby facilitate its eventual reintegration into the European community of nations, end quote. This is almost identical to a quote by Foucault that I share in the book. The same document goes on to specify in perfect line with the position advocated by the Nietzschean Frenchman that the US government will employ commercial, financial, exchange, informational, and diplomatic instruments in implementing its policy toward Eastern Europe. NSDD 75, signed the following year, took things further, according to Richard Pipes, by advocating to change the Soviet system. So external resistance to Soviet imperialism is the basic line within the US documents, and Foucault explicitly advocated for all three of these positions. He was clear about the need for Western governments to exercise, this is a quote from Foucault, their means of pressure on the Soviet Union and on the Eastern camp by the voice of the United States through political and economic negotiations, end quote. So given Foucault's forthright solidarity with the Reagan doctrine and the neoliberal project of counter-revolutionary revanchism, it is unfortunate that the extensive academic debates on his relationship to neoliberalism have remained primarily theoretical, not taking up the all-important question of his practical activities as an anti-communist activist pursuing the Reagan doctrine. I realize that I haven't shared all of the kind of concrete details, but I'm happy to go into them further in the discussion. But in the interest of time, I just want to touch in the last 5 minutes on a question that I often get based on what I've published in some of my public talks around this is, okay, well, this was yesteryear, this was in the 60s and 70s. Well, what about today in the 21st century? Does this still go on or have times changed? There's a very long chapter at the end of the book that basically argues that no, times have not changed insofar as the same basic forces are still operative, although there have been certain very important shifts that have occurred. One of the most important is due to institutional inertia, meaning that given the extent to which the imperial theory industry has been set up and institutionalized, a lot of the forces operative within that have now basically indoctrinated more than one generation of intellectuals. And so there's a kind of inertia to the rightward drift that was being fostered by the Central Intelligence Agency and other forces. Therefore, a lot of the direct intervention isn't as necessary because so many people are swimming downstream, so to speak, by swimming in the direction that the imperial theory industry wants them to swim. I'm just going to touch on a few examples in the contemporary world and leave it at that. I won't be able to get into details, but they're at least important reference points. A great one is someone like Yale professor and highly mediatized public intellectual Timothy Snyder. Timothy Snyder actually was trained by people who were running anti-communist subversion campaigns behind the Iron Curtain, and that's part of the public record. Those were his professors. He has had a prestigious appointment at the Olin Institute for Strategic Studies. If you remember the name of the Olin Institute, this is a foundation that comes out of the arms industry that supported the work of Samuel Huntington that I mentioned at the beginning, right? And so he works at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University. This is a policy, this is focused, Harvard's think tank that he works at, on policy relevant security research and training students for national security positions. The John M. Olin Foundation, I should have mentioned as well, is also on record as having served as a bank for the Central Intelligence Agency, at least for the period between 1958 and 1966. And it is currently involved, along with the Koch brothers, the Richard Mellon Scaife Foundation, and other bourgeois anti-communist foundations in a dark money attempt to reorient the political slant of American higher education to the right. Helmut Harry Loven brought my attention to what's called the Ukrainian History Global Initiative that Timothy Snyder is currently overseeing, that is funded by the pro-Western Ukrainian oligarch Viktor Pinchuk. And Snyder himself has been quite candid about the Ukrainian gravy train that he is on. Quote, "I can think of few endeavors, in contemporary humanities at least, which are on the scale, keeping just under 100 scholars active for around 3 years. If you just do the math, it's a fair amount of money," end quote. So depending on how much the scholars are being paid, Pinchuk's investment in anti-communist revisionist history being overseen by Timothy Snyder is between about $10 and $30 million, right? So just as Huntington was doing this work in the past and continues, So is someone like Timothy Snyder, more as a liberal imperialist than a neoconservative imperialist, but they agree on the essentials, is doing that work today. I'm just going to allude to a few other examples quickly. In 2019, it was revealed that the British Ministry of Defense paid the School of Oriental and African Studies in London hundreds of thousands of pounds for cultural advice on how to operate in its former colonies. Among those who received payments was Professor Gilbert Ashkar, who co-authored a book with Noam Chomsky and frequently contributes to Jacobin Magazine and Democracy Now!, including after the revelations that he was a subcontractor for the British military, right? He himself has publicly identified as a Marxist while vehemently advocating for the overthrow of independent post-colonial governments in Libya and Syria. Professor Chomsky apparently encouraged Ashkar, at least that's what he says, to provide educational resources to the British military, claiming that it's important to let critical voices be heard even among the military. And Professor Chomsky himself has given at least one lecture at the US military's West Point in 2006. And this also influenced the staff decision to, on the part of British military, to mobilize British intellectuals like they did with Ashkar. And the US military runs a very similar unit to the British military, using quote unquote leftist intellectuals to train their own military operatives. Chomsky, I'll just note in passing, is of course a very renowned anti-communist. That's one of the reasons that he's so famous within the capitalist core. I'll share one quote with you. Leninism is, in my view, counter-revolutionary. And I can flesh out where Chomsky goes with this, but he's rabidly anti-communist. It's important to note, moreover, that both Jacobin and Democracy Now! Function in many ways as networks of compatible left media, very much like the frameworks that were supported in the past by the US national security state and the corporatocracy. The foundation world continues to do that. So Democracy Now! Receives Ford Foundation money as well as J.M. Kaplan Fund money, both of which have intimately collaborated with the CIA and functioned as conduits. I'll mention maybe just two examples really quickly and then wrap up. It was revealed in 2022 that the celebrity journalist Paul Mason conspired with intelligence operatives in planning, quote, to wage all-out war on anti-imperialist and left-wing academics, activists, campaign groups, independent journalists, and media sites, end quote. This became quite a, I think, important revelation because it demonstrated that Paul Mason, who is, has published many books and is a celebrity journalist, was working with British intelligence and with British academics to try to set up, but I think it failed because of the revelations, an anti-communist subversion network perfectly modeled on what the history of the IRD and other organizations within Britain have been doing. The last example that I'll point to, and again, I could unpack this further, is that someone like Judith Butler, who comes directly out of the tradition of Foucault and Derrida and the arch-Zionist Emmanuel Levinas, and is obviously part of the intellectual labor aristocracy, has received millions and millions of dollars from the Mellon Foundation in order to set up a critical theory, an international consortium of critical theory programs, and run a whole series of intellectual production and distribution mechanisms, including a journal, a publishing house, international junkets, a whole series of international conferences. And so it demonstrates, again, I'm not getting into the details, but it's important that a non-Marxist anti-totalitarian, which is vocabulary that Butler uses in her book with Laclau and Zizek, radical recuperator, because I think that's what Butler ultimately is precisely the type of compatible left intellectual who's supported by the capitalist ruling class today. Many other examples I could point to, but in the interest of time, I'm going to wrap up there. Thank you so much for listening. I look forward to the questions, comments, maybe some criticisms as well.
Thank you, Gabriel. That was such an interesting talk. It sort of covered a huge ground, gave us something like a Ariadne's thread to go through this labyrinth, at the end of which there is always this monster of anti-communism at work. And those who are players within it, some I think are deeply aware of what they're doing, and others might, as intellectuals, young intellectuals, not having any money for research and project and so on, turn towards it because there is, as you rightly point out, like a celebrity culture. And these areas have all been covered by these famous, 20 or 25 names. And it's very hard for young intellectuals or older ones to find a space, because part of the problem, which I would like to ask you about, is where would one publish in the West or even in the East at this moment, if one had such a contrary view to these celebrities that dominate the world of so-called knowledge with capital K? Where would we go? What to look for?
Yeah, sorry, just so the host knows, I can't unmute myself. I have to be unmuted by the host, just so feel free to do that. It's an excellent question, and there's a book that I edited and co-authored the introduction to by Domenico Lasordo called Western Marxism, which will be coming out in August. And in the introduction to that book, we outline some of these issues, because it's important to know that in the West, the form of quote unquote Marxist discourse that can be published and is widely distributed is compatible left Marxism, usually going under the banner of a libertarian socialist position that traffics easily within anarchism. Verso Books is a great example thereof. Verso has done some good books, Haymarket as well, but within that framework, the fundamental orientation has also been one of not allowing certain voices to be widely distributed. And within the Western world, I think there are some exceptions to that, and it'll be an opportunity to announce as well. This hasn't been publicly proclaimed yet, but with Iskra Books, which I think is one of the better publishers within the Western world, the Critical Theory Workshop is collaborating along with Brill, and we're launching a new book series called Anti-Imperialist Marxism in order to deal with the problem that there's a dearth of platforms to do this type of work and have it published and widely circulated. There are some other examples, mainly of activist presses, and then a lot of the more non-compatible left discourses, if you will, tend to be published by major corporate publishers like Springer or Palgrave Macmillan that only have books that are available to research institutions because they cost $100. And so there are different levels at which this operates, but what it basically means is it is quite difficult to get access to affordable books that take different positions than the dominant positions. And that, of course, has always been one of the goals of controlling the apparatus of knowledge production. So it's very important as well that we try to build as much institutional power as we can through forums like this, through research centers, think tanks, publication platforms, journals, etc. The World Marxist Review was just launched, and I'm involved with that with a number of other people, which is an important endeavor to have an international journal that has the credentials of being peer-reviewed and serious, but is not hostile to those who think that it is worth taking seriously socialism in the real world and not just socialism in the mindscape of Western intellectuals. And so we have to also push on that front in order to develop more infrastructure. But I'll turn it back to you for other questions or comments. Yeah.
So am I unmuted?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I just want to say that to Tondi, are there people waiting in the wing to ask real questions? And I would imagine he would like to hear what questions those are.
We have a questions from Hindol Londi. Hindol, I'm unmuting you. You can ask your question.
Yeah, actually, I had a question about a very specific article I came across in Raphael Samuel's anthology. it's a socialist, pertaining to a socialist anthology. It's Stuart Hall's article called Deconstructing the Popular. It is considered as a very seminal article vis-a-vis the cultural studies, the entire academic apparatus of cultural studies. And I came across a phrase which Hall says it's displaced class conflict, which he pertains to those communities or the masses and the people who are down the socio-political ladder and who express themselves via spaces of hope. If I'm using David Harvey's terminology, in the sense that the festivals and rituals, Hall is saying, has a displaced class conflict in it, inherent in it. And Hall is pertaining to its readers, urging its readers to look for a potential socialist politics or a socialist potential in these festivals or rituals. That is exactly my question. And pertaining to this discussion that was happening, the entire discussion, what is your, Professor, what is your entire idea about Hall, this phrase, and the entire theorization that he's done? This was my question. Thank you.
It's an interesting question. I'm obviously familiar with Stuart Hall's work. I don't have this particular essay fresh in my mind. I would say that I think if you situate Hall within the kind of objective history of the imperial theory industry, Hall represents a kind of new left orientation that comes out of Althusser and post-structuralism. And Althusser, I think, made some important contributions, but also functions as a kind of pivot within the history of the French intelligentsia, rooted in a certain version of the Communist Party, but also then oriented toward Lacanianism and a more eclectic version of Marxism that turns its back on history and historical analysis, turns its back on political economy, etc., and that Stuart Hall is very much coming out of that orientation. So I see him as operating within the kind of new left turn of the radical theory industry, which is not to say, as I mentioned in my opening comments, that we shouldn't engage with variegated analysis and look at whether or not there are elements within the work, for instance, of Althusser or Hall that we might find helpful, but I wouldn't look to them for a systematic and coherent apprehension of contemporary imperialism, for instance, which I think is the most important thing to understand. In the case of the idea of displaced class conflict, as you mentioned, it does make sense to me that there are ways in which the contemporary cultural industries within the imperial core attempt to take class struggle and displace it and to aestheticize it in various ways. You see this in the case of the United States through the sports complex, where the easiest way to mobilize the masses within the United States is to have a sporting event, because then people will be really polarized, really excited, and you can get out tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people. And that displacement, though, operates in such a way that instead of people rooting for their team being the working class, they're rooting for a regionally inscribed team that itself is just training people in regionalist and nationalist thinking and culturalism, ultimately, as opposed to class analysis. So those forms of aestheticized, displaced class conflict can be very dangerous. And I think that's one of the reasons that they work in that way, is to depoliticize people. But what you allude to as well is the possibility of using that displaced class conflict as a kind of site of organizing, if I understood the question correctly. It would be interesting to think about how you can connect with people where they're at and infuse that type of displaced class conflict with more of a socialist orientation. I think we'd have to talk through then and figure out, well, what would be the tactics that could potentially be mobilized in those contexts in order to move something from basically a aestheticized displacement of class struggle to an actual serious class struggle, or at least an education in class struggle. And the example that comes to mind is I do think that there are great artists and cultural producers who are using this kind of mechanisms of displaced class struggle to bring forth a message that is quite different than what you get in the kind of common fodder within the capitalist industry. Someone like Boots Riley, his musical groups like The Coup, is advocating for basically an overthrow of capitalism, and doing it very explicitly with his lyrics, with his organizing, with his movies, with his TV show, etc. And so I think one of the most interesting, at least tactics that I've seen, is trying to use the extant industry against itself in a kind of Trojan horse tactic, where you introduce into the system a message that usually the system excludes, but you smuggle it in because you make the message look somewhat palatable to those who control the means of cultural and intellectual production. So I'll leave it at that and turn it back over to the moderator.
Wonderful.
Okay, so anyone else that want to jump in? And
there is another question written in the chat box by Indranuj Ray. Indranuj asks that, thank you, Professor Rockhill, for the deeply thought-provoking talk. Would you classify the so-called culture war as touted by the American media and their political apparatus, involving the same convenient left with their new icons in the likes of Ibrahim X. Kendi, for example, as the new age superstructure to keep the imperialist hegemony intact by distracting the public with easy hobgoblins in the form of anti-racism and transgenderism? Thank you.
It's an interesting question. I'm not familiar with Ibrahim X. Kendi. Apologies for my ignorance. I mean, I do think that the culture war that the United States has been waging, right, this is often affiliated with the kind of rise of the neoconservative movement within the US context and displacing political conversations, right, to cultural conversations. But I think that that's part of a much larger bourgeois ideological assault on historical and dialectical materialism, which consists in trafficking in race-based thinking and culturalism and identitarian thinking, instead of undertaking a materialist analysis of class and class struggle. And so these aspects of kind of contemporary woke politics are actually just the latest iteration of earlier versions of identity politics and vulgar multiculturalism that go back to a kind of new left anti-communist politics that was prevalent in certain sectors, obviously not all of them, or 60s and 70s. That goes back as well to the kind of social chauvinism that was diagnosed by Lenin in the interwar period, because what they all share is the kind of bourgeois ideology of cultural essentialism, of identitarianism, over and against a kind of a class analysis. And that one thing that is imperative for us to do is to recognize the chameleonic nature of ideology. Ideology, to be successful, does have to change form because people see through it, because reality is quite a powerful force. And Marxist analysis is the most powerful force for elucidating that reality and allowing people to apprehend it in a more objective manner. And so the most recent woke iterations, I think, are just a continuation thereof. I didn't fully understand the references to anti-racism and transgenderism, but I will say one thing that I hope will respond to that, and that is that one of the ways in which the Marxist heritage has been mischaracterized, particularly within the imperial core, because there's an entire industry that's been fabricated around this, is presenting Marxism as only focused on class in some very reductivist economic sense of that term, and not having taken seriously the woman question, the national question, or what people today in the imperial core would call racism and questions of race, or for that matter, sexuality, which is a little bit more of a complicated scenario, but just on the question of the woman question and the national question, what this reveals is a deep and profound institutionalized ignorance concerning actual Marxist theory and actual Marxist practice. And if you do study that history, it becomes very, very clear that in fits and starts, with setbacks, with contradictions, with ongoing class struggles, Marxists have taken very, very seriously the need for national liberation and racial liberation, and that is integral to anti-imperialist Marxism from start to finish. And it's centered the woman question. Insofar as, someone like Lenin said, Engels already said the first form of class struggle was class struggle between man and woman, and that you can judge a degree of emancipation in a society by looking at the relationship between man and women and looking at how emancipated women are. On the racial or national question, someone like Lenin was crystal clear about this, as well as the woman question. He said, we can't win a revolution without women. We need women on board because they're not only exploited, they're super exploited through domestic slavery, and they're oppressed by the structures of the way in which gender relations have tended to be structured under capitalism. And therefore, we need both racial and national liberation and women's liberation as integral to an anti-imperialist Marxist orientation. What this means then is that I think what we need in the contemporary moment is not more woke culturalist identitarian politics, but really a mining down into the history of class struggles in the plural, right? Which include racial struggles and struggles for women's liberation and struggles for sexual liberation, to demonstrate the extent to which the best parts of the Marxist tradition have always been invested not only in theory, but in practice, in changing the extant system, not just addressing these problems at a personal level, at an individual level, or for a class stratum, because ultimately identity politics and woke politics, it's a class politics of the professional managerial class stratum within the imperial core. And so hopefully that, I don't know if it fully addresses your question, but at least will flesh out what my positions are in relationship to some of the issues that you raised.
So is there anyone else?
Yes, we have the another question from Jesse. Jesse, I'm unmuting you. You can ask your question.
Okay. Thanks, Shundeep. So this was an excellent lecture, and I just have two simple but unrelated questions. One is, does structural adjustment come up in your work? It seems that one of the most important vectors that elevate these Western intellectuals is the fact that academic institutions outside of the West were completely gutted in the 1980s. And whole schools of thought become marginalized. You think of, on the African continent, the Dar es Salaam School of Political Economy and History, the Ibadan School, which wasn't Marxist, but you don't hear about it anymore because of structural adjustment. I know the comparative literature department that Ngugi wa Thiong'o founded has been gutted very recently. So that's one question. And then the other is, I don't know if you do much with history, but does the Annales School, and particularly Fernand Braudel, come up in your work? Because he had a very powerful position within the French Academy, very influential, but he also came up with a materialist conception of history that was explicitly non-Marxist and was widely disseminated. So I'm just wondering if that pops up in your research.
Great questions. I don't deal explicitly with structural adjustment, but what you highlight is very important. And if you have resources you want to share with me, I'm an active learner and always interested in new material. What you highlight, though, does at least correspond to some of the concerns in the book, and that is the relationship between the extremely powerful imperial theory apparatus within the core and the destruction of modes of intellectual production within the periphery. And so what I decided to do in this particular book, and actually this also responds a little bit to an earlier question, this book I actually wrote already years ago in French for a French publisher. And then when the French publisher saw the contents of the book, they withdrew in horror because that publisher was making a lot of money off of some of the thinkers that I was being critical of. And so they revealed the kind of principal orientation of the publishing house was more in the interests of their own financial gain than in spreading radical theory that might even be critical of some of the values that have been proffered by that particular publishing house. The reason that I highlight that is also to resonate with the earlier question about like, where can you do this type of anti-imperialist work? But it's also because what was within that book was a whole series of analyses of the way in which the hegemonic apparatus that I'm analyzing in this book goes hand in hand with the repressive apparatus, and that you need to understand both of them together. However, in rewriting the entire book in English over the last few years and changing some of it, I decided to do two books instead of one. So basically, this book is focusing on the kind of hegemonic apparatus, and all of the material from that earlier book manuscript that was focusing on the repressive apparatus, I've integrated into another future book project. I'm not looking, what I have on that book now isn't looking specifically at structural readjustment, but it is looking very specifically at the various ways in which the mighty Wurlitzer, which is the propaganda apparatus set up by the Central Intelligence Agency, a kind of international jukebox by which they control international media and the publication networks, goes hand in hand with an international repressive mechanism that takes many, many different forms. Some of them are directly military, and they just consist in destroying countries. Others consist in targeted assassinations against various intellectuals and political leaders. Others consist in, torture, repression of various sorts. And it's interesting, and I'm taking this as a provocation, I should definitely integrate within that book project some of the ways in which particular forms of collective, institutionalized intellectual production have also been targeted for either destruction or being sidelined, underfunded, other things like that, because you're absolutely right that that's part of the overall equation. Regarding that, and it's not unrelated, the Annales School does come up quite a bit in the book, in part because of Brodel's position within all of this, which is rather complex insofar as you say, Brodel put forth a kind of materialist, interdisciplinary historiography that was in dialogue with certain Marxist traditions. However, at the same time, he was doing two things. One above board, which was the work that he was doing, as you pointed out correctly, is not really Marxist and differs in important ways with the history of Marxist historical scholarship. And on the other hand, more behind the scenes, Brodel was a major academic operator who occupied a pole position at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, which is the EHESS, a famous school in France that came out of an earlier institution, but was eventually institutionalized in 1975, and happened to receive extensive funding from the Ford and Rockefeller foundations. I didn't mention this, but Ford and Rockefeller work so closely historically with the Central Intelligence Agency that they have direct liaisons to the agency, and the presidents of Ford and Rockefeller often just work also either simultaneously or intermittently with the US national security state. So these are corporate cutouts of the bourgeois state. They work hand in glove and they're interlocked. So we can't get confused. In fact, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, when it was revealed in 66, 67, that it was funded by the CIA, it had been funded by the Ford Foundation. And what they decided to do is try to run cover for themselves by just switching all of the funding to Ford Foundation, right? And the Ford Foundation knew about the CIA Foundation because they were meeting with them all the time and talking about their propaganda efforts. So the fact that the school where Brodel was teaching was funded by Rockefeller and Ford shouldn't confuse us about the relationships between those corporations and the US imperial elite and the bourgeois state. Moreover, Brodel was the point person for developing and recruiting forms of what would later kind of become area studies, which is basically an intellectual product of the national security state of the United States, because they wanted people trained so they could become case officers and have specialized knowledge concerning certain areas of the world, and they needed knowledge that was interdisciplinary. Brodel himself, and this has been quite well documented at this point in time, oversaw then meetings with the Ford and Rockefeller foundations about the forms of recruitment, who they would hire and who would get funding within the OHSS, this institution that I was referring to, that I was talking about, which is very explicitly identified as an anti-communist bastion for US American style social sciences and history, right? And the people who worked there for the most part were the structuralists. Barthes was there, Derrida was there, Bourdieu taught there, and many others within that camp. Structuralism within the French scene, prior to the US influence, was basically of a part with post-structuralism. That distinction didn't really exist early on within the French Academy. So that's why I refer to someone like Derrida as a structuralist. And the Annales School was the other main bastion within the OHSS. And Brodel very explicitly explained to his funders that they could operate in such a way that there were a few communists, members of the French Communist Party, who were at this institution, and that Brodel would personally guarantee that any funding coming in from these corporations wouldn't fall into communist hands, and that he could oversee that from behind the scenes, right? So he was directly involved in guaranteeing that the US corporatocracy that works hand in glove with the US national security state on anti-communist intellectual propaganda would operate in such a way that the funding got to the real sources of the anti-communist intellectuals, the structuralists, and the Annales school, and kept the communists isolated. That is, I think, a very important part of this history. The final thing that I'll note on this is there is a 1985 CIA report that is now part of the public record and was released. And in that report on the role of the French intelligentsia, the CIA operatives who wrote this identified two great allies. They said, this is not an exact quote, but a paraphrase, the Annales school of historiography and structuralism have made important and lasting contributions to the struggle to develop an anti-Marxist form of social science, right? So the CIA was on the exact same page as the corporatocracy. They identified these people as assets who they wanted to and did support. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, if there isn't anyone else right now, I have a question that I'd like to ask Gabriel. Is there anyone else?
Yes, there is one question asked by Onustup Bosu. He is asking that I would like to know your specific views on two theoretical turns in the last few decades. Within brackets, there are so many, and you mentioned quite a few of them. One, the utopian and messianic Marxism of the West, best exemplified by Jameson, Agamben, Hart, and Negri, and drawn from the Frankfurt School. That, of course, overturns Engels' distinction between scientific and utopian socialism. Two, the tendency to read Marx together with Spinoza, Althusser, Balibar, Hart, and Negri. Thanks.
Well, I guess Gabriel wants to respond to that.
Yeah, those are great questions. And there's a chapter in the book that deals very explicitly with this. The title of the chapter is Radical Theories, Infantile Disorder, drawing, of course, on Lenin's important criticisms of the anarchist and kind of utopian elements within the libertarian socialist camp. And regarding the very first question, I think it's important to situate the context in which this more radical version of theory became prominent, and that is the early 21st century. Because in the 80s and 90s, at least within the Imperial core, a lot of the discussions were about post-structuralism and how it could be political, ethical, et cetera, and you have all of that kind of unfolding, while these forms of French post-structuralism are providing intellectual veneer to identity politics and vulgar multiculturalism, in short. And so it's all about proliferating differences, respecting differences, and abandoning class analysis. Derrida famously said, I can't use the word class. I don't know what it means. Of course, not asking whether or not maybe someone else could use the word class to describe the position of a petty bourgeois intellectual who feigns not to know what class is, right? Which would be Derrida himself. By the time we get to the early 21st century, you have the dismantling of the Soviet-style socialism, neoliberalism going into overdrive, and the US imperial machine going into overdrive in the wake of September 11th, 2001, in particular with the kind of New American Century project. And within that very specific context of the early 21st century, you have a real new market niche that emerges, and that is a kind of radical theory that purports to be and often presents itself as against postmodernism, against the philosophy of difference, etc. So you have Zizek becoming a major commodity. You have Badiou, you have Rancière, you have Hart and Negri, this whole kind of complex. You have Agamben, of course, as well. Jameson had been around prior to that point in time. Jameson also generally avoids making really explicit political statements. So he was on board to a certain extent with that project, but wasn't promoted in exactly the same way. If you know the 3 volumes of the book, The Idea of Communism would be a great example of this idealist version of Marxism. And so they all presented themselves as a return to Marx. What you get actually in these books and in their writing in general, and I can't sum all of this chapter up as we speak, is a really, really, I think, horrific misrepresentation of the history of Marxism, a turn away from historical materialism, a complete abandonment of dialectical materialism, and a utopian version of messianic Marxism that says very explicitly that what they're invested in is the idea of communism, and they are explicit idealists. Etienne Balibar is a good example of it, an explicit idealist. And in that regard, what they say is that actually existing socialism is a complete and absolute nightmare, a horror of horrors, the worst thing that has ever occurred in the history of humanity. That's what Zizek says. Badiou basically says as much in important interviews on British TV. Hart and Negri say that, well, the distinction between capitalism and socialism is no longer operative because that's a modern concept. And we have this new postmodern way of thinking in which these categories are no longer operative. And so we're going to talk about empire instead of imperialism. We're going to talk about the multitude, which is not the working class. It's not the proletariat, right? So they introduced this very idiosyncratic vocabulary to basically reinvent the old forms of utopian Marxism and engage in the basic crass forms of, paleo-conservative anti-communism, but under the guise of being radicals. In that regard, I think they really need to be called out for what they are. They're radical recuperators. They present themselves as radical, and their fundamental social function is to recuperate insurgent forces around the world within the pro-capitalist, pro-imperialist field. Proof thereof is the fact that the third volume of the idea of communism was presented where? In a US military-controlled neo-colony of South Korea, and it's explicitly proclaimed that they could not utter these ideas in China or in North Korea because these are totalitarian societies to be condemned like all totalitarian societies, etc. So they explicitly, in their practice as well, line up on, and the other two conferences took place or three of them, I think they were Berlin, London, and New York, right? So the, centers of imperial capitalism. This is where these people operate. This is where they're supported. This is where they're promoted. And so scientific socialism is out the window for these people. They don't do materialist analysis. And quite honestly, when you compare their research, so-called, to the historical and social scientific research of real Marxists, it's a joke. It's really embarrassing that people would take these books seriously, as I did, because I was trained to take them seriously. But then I learned a lot better, and I think a lot of other people should, and hopefully they will, and I'll make a contribution to that. Regarding the red Spinozist turn, this is also, as I mentioned very briefly early on, the orientation coming out of Althusser is using Spinoza over and against, other figures within the Marxist tradition, and it's imbuing a kind of metaphysics into socialism, meaning that then socialism becomes about these kind of forces, and it becomes detached from a concrete materialist analysis of class struggle. Balibar early on remained in Althusserian, but then he went hardcore Derridian and very opposed to Cuba and any form of actually existing socialism. He supports lifting the blockade, right, which is an absolute minimum because it's illegal in any case, but refers to Cuba as an authoritarian dictatorship, which I think is absurd to the extreme. I haven't given examples in my talk of what my positions are on actually existing socialism, where I take them from, etc., some of the debates within them, but I take at a minimum that socialism in the real world is worthy of erudite and scholarly engagement, not genuflection to the dominant ideology where you simply say the same thing as the US State Department. And these thinkers, these group of thinkers, if you work through it, at the end of the day, their ideological positions are almost a cut and paste job from the US State Department regarding their enemies, right? They will say certain things about capitalism being bad and horrific. Most of that is based on a kind of subjective phenomenological orientation that consists in criticizing consumer society and things like this. Some of them have taken slightly different positions, like Badiou wasn't supportive of the NATO intervention in Libya, where Jean-Luc Nancy was. Setting the bar pretty low when you finally have somebody taking a relatively principled position on imperialism and then a lot of other people not doing that. So anyway, there's more that could be said about that. I think there's a follow-up question about the views on the role of anti-structuralist movement in theory, which cropped in view of criticism of Althusser.
Yes.
I don't know if somebody wants to flesh that question out, but I'll stop there.
So we have a comment from Onustup, who asked the previous question, making Marx a pantheist via Spinoza.
Making Marx a
pantheist via Spinoza.
Exactly. exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a spiritualization of material relations. I mean, it's literally, I mean, Badiou is and Zizek as well. I mean, they defend basically Christian positions. They're believers in a spirit world, and they very explicitly say the idea of communism is so important because it transcends socialism, and socialism is this terrestrial form that's to be condemned. Zizek was involved in anti-communist destabilization efforts very explicitly against Yugoslavia, which was socialist at the time. So Badiou is probably the furthest left of all these figures just because he is a self-declared Maoist. But what he means by that is this Western cultural form of Maoism in which he fetishizes this very specific time period within the history of the Cultural Revolution and says, okay, there was this great moment that we should return to, but everything else is to be condemned, which is a classic kind of idealist fetishization of the great moment in the past, which needs to be reborn today, without a materialist analysis of contemporary China, or for that matter, of other contemporary projects that are anti-imperialist.
So, Shundip, are we done?
Yes, yes, we are done with the questions. We don't have any more questions.
So I have not a question, but I would like to reflect a little bit, if it's possible, for a few minutes.
Yes, yes.
Hello?
Please go ahead. Yes, please go ahead. Go ahead.
I can neither, I can't see Gabriel anymore.
Can you hear us, Professor Bannerji?
I can kind of hear, but I can't see and not hear very clearly either.
We can see you and we can hear you. You can ask your question or your remarks.
Well, I would really like to sort of mention this because it's not a theoretical issue. But ever since for the last 50 years that I've lived in North America, well, my habitus has been generally Canada, but there's a kind of, what should I say, voluntaristic character to any kind of left thinking. I mean, Marxist corrections on Marxism, new Marxism, anti-Marxism, but there's really nothing that is activist, political, long-term project that helps people to stay the course. Neither in US nor in Canada really do we have a left political party. So I've gone there for 50 years ago, learned about many very valuable things on feminism, anti-racism, and various other questions. But at the same time, I didn't see anything but a kind of now we do it, now we don't do it kind of approach or attitude. How academics say something, how they don't, or even general or intellectuals in the left. I just think that there would be a really practical necessity for having a left political party and communist identified that can do some kind of or offer a little roadmap to where we want to go politically. Because unless these social movements have something to bind with, and unless groups that call themselves class-oriented thinkers or working class sort of supporters have something to bind with the social movements with, the way of looking at class as only an economic formation will probably remain there as a kind of a major obstacle. Because when they do culture, they don't do class. When people do class, they don't do anything with culture, which is why I started with Gabriel's talking about his work as somebody that politicizes aesthetics, and unlike those who aestheticize politics. So I just wondered Gabriel's opinion, because after all, after 1968, which seems to be always the date that people go back to when there's signal to some crisis in communism in Europe. How much crisis was really there, or how much communism was really there, and what happened afterwards? I don't know if I've been able to reach to you some basic ideas to you. Yeah.
They're really, really important points that you highlight, and the intellectuals that I'm critical of in the book basically share an anti-party ideology and an anti-state ideology, right? So getting organized in the party form is bad because it's hierarchical and vertical and has led to atrocities, and states are just totalitarian forces. It's a classic anarchist argument that they try to put forth under Marxist clothing, which with apparently being ignorant or ignoring all of the longstanding Marxist critiques of anarchism. And so I couldn't agree more that the party form is necessary for getting people really organized, educating them, and being able to fight and win, as opposed to the social movement model or a more horizontalist model, which can play certain roles for bringing people in, educating them, connecting networks, et cetera, but has not proven itself in material history to be able to fight and win. On the contrary, a lot of social movements are ones that are very easy to infiltrate, destroy, misdirect, et cetera, as the history of countries in the imperial core demonstrate. And the history of those parties is a complex one, right? And we could do a whole session talking about the history of the CPUSA, which in the case of the United States, and in the 1930s and 1940s, or at least 1930s, they were really doing a lot of this very important anti-racist work and work with unemployment, work with labor in general. It was anti-imperialist, et cetera. The orientation that party has taken over time has shifted, like a lot of the communist or socialist parties within the imperial core, because they've become more oriented towards an agenda of working within the kind of parliamentary system and are more kind of reformist in some of their orientation. That said, some of these parties continue to do some important work in certain sectors, and I think it's important to be able to both recognize that and work with them. The other major impact has been so many of the Trotskyist offshoots from these parties that tend to create sectarianism, splintering on the left, and then they lay claim to being the only true party, the real communists, the ones who really know how it's to be done, et cetera, sometimes creating really top-heavy hierarchical organizations that actually do fall into some of the things that the anarchists are critical of, and I think that we should be critical of, because they're not working class driven organizations. So that everything that you outlined, I couldn't agree more with, and hopefully we'll have follow-up exchanges about this, because it's one of the most important things for us to do at this moment in time. Regarding your reference to 68, I think that 68, at least within the kind of Euro-American context, ends up being an important watershed, in part because of the ways in which the most important elements within the imperial core, France, I'll take as an example because I happen to know it well, was the working class movement. It was the largest strike in the history of Europe that was organized in 1968, and it was led by communists. And so that was a very important part of that struggle, and workers made real substantive gains at that point in time, while at the same time, they did not consider it to be a revolutionary situation. And that's where they differed with the students and a lot of the petty bourgeois kind of radical elements that were anti-communist and largely anarchist and utopian socialist, who claimed it was a revolutionary situation, but we don't need a party to do this. We can just do it through occupations, mass mobilizations, and through the movement, if you will. But it wasn't clear how that was going to happen. And so people like Michel Clouscar and other important French Marxists have criticized it for being a magical third way politics, where we're going to revolutionize the system, but we don't have a coherent plan, we don't have tactics, we don't have strategies, we're not organized, et cetera. And so a lot of what came out of 68 was this kind of new left utopianism that really was headed nowhere. And in the wake of 68, the French state, and it was similar in other contexts, undertook an absolutely repressive approach that was draconian. They were rounding up people for distributing literature that was leftist. They were shutting down publishing houses. It was illegal to show films about 1968. I mean, post-68 French government went really, really authoritarian and had a massive crackdown on the left. But at the same time, it allowed for a lot of that insurgent anarchist kind of approach to then become incorporated within the intelligentsia. And a lot of the French thinkers then got on that bandwagon and renamed themselves as 68 thinkers. When they were all opposed to the workers' movement, many of them were skeptical of 68 in general, questioning the student movement in various ways, sometimes in legitimate ways, but in general, it's from the point of view of petty bourgeois professors who had institutionalized positions of power. And so another effect of 68 is that then what you have is a kind of symbolic radicality that becomes a hot commodity in the wake of 68 because everybody wanted to identify with the movement. So just as people around the world would, buy Che Guevara t-shirts, buying up Foucault's books or Lacan's books within a very specific class segment of the professional managerial class and those who aspire to it, students and youth, et cetera, that's what becomes very fashionable. And it's part of the radical marketing, if you will, of French theory, when in fact what was going on the ground was counter-revolutionary. It was against the strong kind of working class movement that was overseen by parties and strong unions. And so it's part of the kind of drift to the right. And so if we want to reignite the spirit of the 60s, I think that we have to do it in such a way that it's not about reigniting this anarchist utopian spirit, but reigniting the elements of the 60s that themselves were reigniting within the imperial core the very important struggles of the kind of interwar period in the 30s, when it was about anti-imperialism and a form of class-based emancipation from colonialism, from women's oppression and exploitation, and from racial oppression and exploitation. And so I guess that's how I would kind of frame that. And the last thing that I'd say is that in order to do that, we can't do that on our own as individuals. We have to do that collectively, and we need to build institutional power through having our own intellectual apparatus that we control and that we, own, as much as possible. And that we also need to do it in such a way that we're working with unions, organizations, associations, political parties in order to build real power instead of just trafficking in this kind of social movement politics that is way too easy to shut down. In that regard, I shared in the chat, one of the endeavors I'm involved in is the Critical Theory Workshop, which is co-hosting or co-sponsoring this event, which is an educational nonprofit that we use as a kind of platform for forms of education that are quite difficult to do within the Imperial University. So if anybody's interested in it, check out the call for applications. And we do a lot of other activities as well. So check out the website if you're interested. The goal in sharing that is not self-promotion as much as it is demonstrating the importance of we need to do institution building. We need to do it together. We need to do it collectively in a non-sectarian fashion, because that's the real way of building power. So I'll leave it at that.
Sounds great. We could go on for a month or two about each one of these topics. They're very important. And thank you, Gabriel, for such a wonderful talk. Rich. We could take each piece and discuss later on. Thank you. And Shondeep, it's yours.
Thanks a lot, Professor Bannerji, and thanks a lot, Professor Gabriel Rockhill. As Professor Rockhill mentioned, that this talk today is co-sponsored by Critical Theory Workshop. We have a call for application for the summer school organized by Critical Theory Workshop in the chat box. And we will circulate the call for application through email to everyone who joined this talk today and more. But I would like to ask Professor Suchetana Chattopadhyay from Center for Marxian Studies, Jadavpur University, who is co-sponsoring this event, for any concluding comments if she has.
Gabriel, thank you very much. Actually, what you said reminded me of a thriller written by Per Vallu called Murder on the 31st Floor. And I think all of us should read it again after we read Gabriel's book. So I look forward to reading Gabriel's book and then returning to Murder on the 31st Floor again. I mean, given the state of the late bourgeois academia, the attack on public education, the kind of fascist attacks we face every day, I think this kind of talk should be organized by us in the future, and we should all build a solidarity, not a network, not that word from the corporate academia, but real solidarity, so that our words resonate in future. Thank you again. Thank you, Himani, and thank you, Gabriel, and Shondip. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was a
Yes.
great honor and pleasure, and I hope that we'll be able to collaborate in the future and continue pushing things in the right direction. I look forward to remaining in contact and finding other opportunities to collaborate.
Certainly, we will keep in touch with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
you.